They picked the wrong person, and now they must pay the price. Some people think they can insult others without facing any consequences. They mistake silence for weakness, believing that the bullied person will forever bow their head. But sometimes they mess with the wrong person. This is the story of Jaden Carter, a quiet black boy who was always mocked, not just for his differences, but for the color of his skin, in a school where he wasn't welcomed. Bradley Walker, the arrogant sports star, took pleasure in tormenting Jaden, but what he didn't know was that Jaden wasn't as weak as he thought, and when things crossed the line, the hunter became the prey. Get ready for a twist no one saw coming. Have you ever felt misjudged, like everyone just looked at your outside without knowing who you really are? There are people who are seen as weak, inferior, and bullied every day. They're ridiculed, looked down upon, and pushed out of the society around them. But sometimes the bullies don't know they've picked the wrong person. This is the story of Jaden Carter, a quiet, smart black boy who always kept to himself. Avoiding the crowd, he didn't like to draw attention, and didn't have a close group of friends to protect him. But in this school that didn't make him safe, instead, it made him a target. Jaden wasn't just bullied for his quiet nature, he was mocked because of the color of his skin, in a school where most students were white. He was always seen as different, and different meant weak. And among those who found ways to torment Jaden, Bradley Walker was the worst. He was the school's football star, always favored by teachers and praised by his friends. He was tall, strong, and always surrounded by a group of buddies. To Bradley, Jaden was just a joke. "There's no place for you here, kid." That was catchphrase whenever he saw Jaden walking down the hall. And the scariest part was no one ever objected. The people around just laughed. Or worse, they stayed silent. Maybe they were scared of Bradley, or maybe they thought Jaden didn't belong here in the first place. But either way, day by day, Jaden had to face isolation, mockery, and contempt. But what no one knew was the storm was coming. Bradley thought Jaden was weak. He didn't know that Jaden had had enough, and he certainly didn't know that he had messed with the wrong person. However, Jaden had no idea that in Bradley's eyes, none of that was enough. He didn't just want to make Jaden a victim. He wanted to turn him into a fool in front of the entire school. He wasn't satisfied with just a small group witnessing the humiliation he inflicted on Jaden. He wanted an audience, wanted to make Jaden the center of mockery, wanted the whole school to laugh at him. And so he came up with a plan that morning. When Jaden approached his locker as usual, he quickly noticed something was off the hallway. Seemed more crowded than usual. Small groups of students had gathered, whispering to each other and glancing at him. Some were laughing quietly, while others raised their phones as if waiting for some kind of reaction from him. Jaden felt a wave of unease rising in his chest. Then he saw it. A crumpled piece of paper was taped to his locker door. The handwriting was messy, but clear, and each word seemed to carve itself into Jaden's mind. "Don't forget your big performance. You should dance hip-hop. It would be perfect for you." His heart raced, an uneasy feeling spread through his chest as he carefully peeled the paper off the locker. The whispering voices around him became clearer. Something wasn't right. A performance he hadn't signed up for any event. Jaden's suspicions were confirmed when a group of students walked past. Sneering and showing him their phones, the screen displayed the latest post on the school's social media page. "Don't miss tonight's hottest act. Jaden Carter will showcase his hidden talent. Who can guess what he'll do?" Jaden's throat went dry. He scrolled through the comments. A wave of mocking responses appeared. "Maybe he'll read a book on stage. Haha. I'm guessing it's going to be a rap performance. What else could be more fitting? Maybe he plans to do magic and disappear from the school." Jaden's hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't need to guess who was behind this. It was no one but Bradley. And then, just as he expected, the familiar voice echoed behind him. Surprised, Jaden slowly turned around. Bradley was standing there, arms crossed, a smug smile plastered on his face. His friends were standing around him, giggling as if all of them were waiting for a reaction from Jaden, a look of fear, a plea. Jaden just stared at him, silent. Bradley shrugged exaggeratedly, painting innocence. I thought you could use a little spotlight. I mean, staying quiet all the time is kind of boring, so I decided to help you out a bit. Laughter erupted around him. Don't disappoint us, he continued, giving Jaden a light pat on the shoulder before turning and walking away, leaving Jaden standing there. There, the paper still clutched tightly in his hand, Jaden felt like the world was spinning. He had been tricked. This wasn't just some silly game. It was a carefully planned trap. Bradley didn't just want to embarrass him. He wanted the whole school to witness the humiliation. He couldn't back out. He couldn't withdraw his name. If he didn't show up tonight, everyone would call him a coward. And if he showed up without a prepared act, that would be even worse. This was how Bradley wanted to crush him. Jaden clenched the paper tightly, a simmering rage. Rising within him for the first time, he didn't just feel helpless, he felt angry. But there was something else deep inside that anger, something Jaden had never shown before, a determination. Bradley thought he had set the perfect trap. He thought tonight would be the moment Jaden completely broke down in front of the whole school. But there was one thing he didn't know. Jaden was no longer the weak person he thought he was. He had pushed Jaden to the limit. And when a person is backed into a corner, they'll do things no one expects. The atmosphere inside the auditorium was filled with excitement, not because everyone was expecting an impressive performance, but because they were all eagerly waiting for a spectacle. From the front rows to the back of the hall, students huddled in groups, the sound of chatter blending with bursts of laughter. The bright stage lights illuminated the stage, reflecting in the eyes of those eagerly anticipating a public humiliation that no one wanted to. Miss Bradley sat in the front row, arms crossed, legs stretched out comfortably, a victorious expression on his face, as he watched his plan unfold exactly as expected as soon as Jaden Carter's name was called. Whispers and giggles filled the room, growing louder with anticipation. In a corner of the hall, Jaden sat still, his shoulders tense, his eyes staring down at the floor as if trying to steady his breath to control the rapid beating of his heart in his chest. He knew this moment would come, but that didn't make the fear any less. The eye on him from every direction pierced his mind like daggers, the snickering laughs ringing in his ears, stirring waves of embarrassment and shame. Rising within his chest, suddenly a sharp voice cut through the air, tearing apart the mocking atmosphere. "Come on, show us. The street kid dance." The entire room erupted, laughter ringing from every corner, spreading like waves, growing louder, more malicious. Jaden didn't need to turn around to know who had shouted. That Bradley remained seated, his face beaming with a smug smile, while his friends laughed hysterically, slapping each other on the back as if they had just witnessed the greatest joke ever. Jaden swallowed hard, his hand unconsciously balling into a fist. He knew he couldn't escape, couldn't avoid it, couldn't pretend nothing was happening. If he didn't get up, the ridicule would continue tomorrow, the day after. Even months later, the hallways would be filled with mocking laughter and whispered taunts. If he stood up, he would face ultimate humiliation, but if he didn't, he would forever be seen as a coward. With a heavy breath, Jaden forced himself to stand his legs, feeling as if they were glued to the floor, but he managed to take slow, deliberate steps toward the stage. All eyes were on him, the laughter continuing, catcalls and jeers from the audience making each step heavier. The blinding stage lights hit him as he climbed the stairs, the sensation like walking into the center of an arena where he was the sole prey among a pack of beasts. His hand shook as he gripped the microphone, but as soon as he opened his mouth to say something, a screeching sound suddenly blared through the speakers, stretching unnaturally, distorting his voice into something unrecognizable. The distorted sound echoed throughout the hall, followed by a moment of stunned silence, before the entire auditorium erupted in a storm of mocking laughter. Bradley slapped his thigh, laughing so hard his eyes teared up. "Oh my God, listen to his voice," he said, slapping his friends on the back, and they all burst into laughter, the sound of their enjoyment unstable, as if this was the highlight of the evening. Jaden stood there, his eyes wide, his hand still clutching the microphone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could hear the laughter ringing everywhere, see the faces of those who were laughing uncontrollably, feel the sneering, mocking gazes, as if he was no longer human, just a cheap entertainment for the crowd. The entire auditorium was drowning him in a wave of humiliation, leaving no space to breathe. His throat was tight, his eyes burning, his breathing labored not out of fear, but because a surge of anger was rising in his chest, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. For years, he had endured, bowed his head silently, walked away, letting people like Bradley push him around, laugh at him, trample on him, without resistance. But did that make things better? Better. The more he stayed silent, the louder they became. The more he endured, the bolder they got tonight, as the entire school laughed at him, as everyone who had ignored his existence suddenly took interest in him just to see him be humiliated. Jaden realized something: they would never stop, unless he made them stop tonight. Bradley thought he had destroyed him, thought he had made him bow his head forever, but what he didn't know was that it was he who had pushed Jaden past the final boundary. He didn't know that at this very moment, Jaden was no longer the same person. Jaden said nothing. He simply lowered the microphone slowly, silently, placing it back on the stand, turned and walked off the stage. The laughter chased after him, the crazy laughter continuing, but this time it didn't touch him. He walked down the stairs through the aisle between the rows of seats, his eyes empty, but inside his mind, something had awakened. He had endured enough, and Bradley would soon realize that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Jaden couldn't remember how he had left the auditorium. He only knew that his feet moved aimlessly, leaving behind the mocking laughter still echoing everywhere. He didn't look at anyone, nor did he stop when he heard the whispers and the curious gazes following his fading figure. His mind was blank, but in his chest a strange feeling was growing, something he had never let himself fully feel before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't despair. It was anger he had endured for so many years. Tried to ignore the teasing, tolerated every shove, every humiliation, swallowed his anger to keep himself safe, believing that if he didn't resist, everything would eventually pass. But now he understood it would never stop Bradley, and those like him would never voluntarily give up the power they had by trampling on others. They only knew how to push forward, taking advantage of his silence to continue mocking and crushing his self-respect. The anger surged within him like a violent wave, rolling over him in waves that he could no longer control. And then for the first time in his life, Jaden didn't try to suppress it that night. He didn't sleep. He sat on his bed, his back against the cold wall, staring blankly into the emptiness before him. Bradley's mocking laughter and the entire school's still echoed in his head, repeating over and over like a broken tape. But this time it no longer scared or embarrassed him. It only fueled the anger simmering in his chest, his hand unconsciously clenched into a fist. Then suddenly an old memory flooded back, the image of his father, a strong man with stern eyes full of love standing in the gym, his shirt soaked with sweat, his old boxing gloves on his hands. The sound of his punch hitting the punching bag was loud and firm. He could still smell the rubber from his father's gloves, remember his father's laugh when his first punch missed the target, and feel his strong hand on his shoulder. When he faltered, his father, Jerome Carter, had been a professional boxer. He wasn't just a skilled fighter, but a true warrior, a man who lived by discipline, honor, and perseverance. From the time Jaden was a child, his father had taught him everything he knew: how to balance, how to strike, how to read an opponent's movements. But the most important thing his father had taught him was that true strength didn't lie in the hardest punch, but in knowing when to use it. And when his father passed away, Jaden had sworn he would never use those skills to hurt anyone. He didn't want violence, he didn't want to fight. But now things were different. He didn't want to fight, but he couldn't keep bowing his head anymore. If he didn't stand up right now, he would be trampled for the rest of his life. He needed to change. Jaden took a deep breath and stood up. He walked over to the corner of the room where his father's old gym bag had been kept all these years. He unzipped it, rummaged through it, and the old boxing gloves appeared still intact as they were. All those years ago, he picked up the familiar feeling immediately overtaking him, as if every cell in his body was recalling what had been buried all these years. Without hesitation, he put on the gloves. He stepped into the middle of the room, his feet naturally widening, taking the ready stance, the familiar sensation flooding back as if it had never left him. He began to move each step light but controlled. He raised his hand in front of him, moving them in a rhythm he knew well, then he punched. The first punch was just a test, but immediately his body recognized the sensation. His heartbeat quickened, and his breath became more steady. He continued each punch harder than the last feeling. Every muscle tightened with each movement, sweat began to drip down his forehead. But he didn't stop. He kept jumping rope, each jump fast and precise. Every move steady, as though it had been ingrained in his body since he was a child. He practiced reflexes by using the speed bag hanging from the ceiling, landing each punch accurately on the target. Each punch was a declaration he was no longer Jaden Carter. From yesterday, he was no longer the quiet kid others could easily mock, and Bradley would soon realize that he had awakened a monster. He would never be able to control the night before Jaden had trained, until his shirt was soaked with sweat, until his joints felt like they were about to give out, until each punch was no longer a mere repetitive motion, but had become a part of his body, as if an instinct that had been buried for too long had finally awakened. He was not just rebuilding his physical strength, he was reshaping who he was. When the first light of morning filtered through the window, Jaden sat on the floor, his hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly but steadily. He was no longer the Jaden of yesterday. He was no longer the quiet boy who always kept his head down while walking through the hallways, no longer the one who got knocked down without resistance, no longer the nameless victim among those stronger than him. He had endured enough, and now he would not shy away anymore. He didn't need to seek revenge, he didn't need to fight anyone, but there was something more important. He needed respect, and today everyone would see that Jaden walked into school. The door creaked open, and immediately he felt the eyes on him. The students still gathered in groups along the hallway. Still, the familiar faces, still the ones who had laughed at him in the auditorium the day before, but today, something had changed. He wasn't walking with hunched shoulders, he wasn't looking down, avoiding the gazes around him. He walked with a quiet confidence, each step firm as if the whole world could no longer touch him. This wasn't arrogance, this wasn't showing off. It was simply the feeling of someone who knew exactly who they were and no longer feared anything. Whispers began to spread. Some stared at him, something unfamiliar in their gaze. Others waited for him to bend down, waiting for any sign of weakness to continue mocking him. But it didn't come. Then, amidst the crowd, a familiar voice called out, "Oh, it's the street kid again." The hallway seemed to freeze for a brief moment. Everyone standing nearby reflexively turned to look as if they could smell the tension of an impending confrontation. Bradley Walker leaned against a locker, arms crossed, a mocking gaze in his eyes, his face smug. He didn't realize that in just one night, everything had changed. Jayon stopped, but instead of shying away, instead of bowing his head and walking away like usual, he did something no one had ever seen him do before. He looked Bradley straight in the eye and he smiled. Not a shy smile, not a forced smile from someone trying to hide fear, but a soft, knowing smile full of confidence, not challenging, but also not. Yielding in that moment, something shifted in Bradley. He was used to seeing Jaden avoid him. He was used to watching him bow his head, trying to become as small as possible, trying to blend into the wall to avoid attention, but now standing in front of him was no longer the weak boy he had stepped on. Something was off. Bradley frowned, but quickly masked his discomfort with a half smirk. "What are you smiling about, Carter? You think this is funny?" The people around him laughed, but this time something had shifted in the air. The laughter was no longer as bold as before. A few people began looking at each other as if they were beginning to sense that something was wrong. Jaden didn't respond immediately. He just tilted his head slightly as if evaluating the person in front of him, as if he was seeing Bradley in an entirely different way. After a moment, he replied, his voice calm but sharp, like a knife hidden under velvet number. "I'm just wondering." Bradley raised an eyebrow, wondering about what Jaden shrugged. Rugged, his voice still calm, as if this conversation was no big deal. "I'm wondering when you'll realize that you're not worth my time." Silence filled the hallway. Bradley blinked, taking a second to process what he had just heard. He was used to controlling everything, used to people bowing their heads whenever he spoke. But now, for the first time, Jaden wasn't avoiding him, wasn't scared, wasn't showing any hesitation. For the first time, Bradley wasn't so sure there was something about the way Jaden looked at him, the way he stared at him without flinching, as if he was no longer the giant monster that everyone thought he was, as if he were just an ordinary guy, nothing to be afraid of. And for the first time in his life, Bradley felt something he had never felt before. Not anger, not rage, but unease. But of course, he wasn't going to show it. He wasn't going to let someone like Jaden Carter shake him. He laughed, but it sounded forced. Nice talk. "Carter, let's see how long you can keep that attitude up." Jaden just looked at him, saying nothing, but the smile still remained on his lips. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Bradley standing there feeling a discomfort he couldn't explain. No one said anything, but everyone could see it clearly. Jaden Carter was no longer the prey, and a storm was about to hit the atmosphere. In the hallway still lingered with the remnants of the confrontation. Earlier that morning, Bradley stood there, his gaze following Jaden's retreating figure. But his mind was filled with conflicting thoughts that he couldn't even comprehend. There was something different about Jaden today. No longer the timid, fearful boy he could easily trample on like always. It wasn't just the way he looked at him, but the feeling as if he no longer had control over everything, and he hated it. He needed an opportunity to prove that everything was still within his grasp, that Jaden Carter was still the predictable prey he could torment whenever he pleased, and it didn't take long for that opportunity to arise. That afternoon, the school cafeteria was as noisy as ever. Students crowded around the service counter, trays clattering together, conversations echoing everywhere, the smell of hot food filling the cramped space. Bradley and his friend sat at the center table, the best spot where everyone could see him. Part of it was because he liked the attention, and part of it was because from there he could easily observe the whole cafeteria and pick out who would be the next victim of his teasing. He didn't need to look for long. Jaden walked into the cafeteria, tray in hand, walking silently, but with determination, no longer with his head down, no longer avoiding anyone he passed by. Bradley, without even glancing at him, as if he didn't exist. And that made Bradley furious. He was so used to Jaden avoiding him, so used to seeing him with his head bowed whenever he passed by. But now, for the second time that day, he felt ignored, and he couldn't let that continue. As soon as Jaden placed his tray on the table and was about to sit down, a shadow appeared next to him. Bradley. Jaden knew he wouldn't just walk away, but this time he wasn't the same person anymore. Before Jaden could react, Bradley grabbed his tray, lifted it with one hand, and dumped all the food on him. A shock spread throughout the cafeteria. No one said anything. No one laughed like they usually did. Those who were used to seeing Jaden being bullied suddenly felt something was off. Like this wasn't like the other times. Everyone waited for Jaden's reaction. The entire room fell eerily silent. All eyes were on him. Some waited for him to bow his head. Like always, some even had their phones ready, prepared to capture the moment when he quietly walked away, as he always did. But what they didn't expect was for Jaden to stand there, his gaze calm, as if nothing had just happened. He didn't look at his soaked clothes, didn't frantically wipe the food off, didn't do anything Bradley expected. Instead, he slowly stood up, his eyes never leaving Bradley. A long silence passed. Then Jaden spoke, his voice devoid of anger or fury, only a chilling calmness. "Punch me." The people around almost held their breath. A few raised their eyebrows. Others exchanged looks as if unsure whether they had heard correctly. Bradley blinked, taken aback for a moment, but he immediately burst out laughing, a laugh full of contempt. "Are you joking?" Jaden didn't flinch, not even a moment's hesitation, his gaze still holding that terrifying calmness. "Do it show the whole school how strong you are?" Bradley's smile stiffened, not because of Jaden's words, but because of the way he said them. There was no pleading, no provocation, no tremble in his voice, just a simple sentence. Yet it carried a certainty that made Bradley feel something was off. He had punched Jaden before he had pushed him to the ground, mocked him, made him a laughing stock. But every time Jaden silently endured it, silently walked away. But this time, Jaden wasn't walking away this time. Jaden was waiting for him to strike not just him, but everyone in. The cafeteria was staring at the scene as if they didn't recognize Jaden anymore. Something was very wrong. For the first time, Bradley hesitated. He didn't know why he could easily punch Jaden right now, could knock him to the floor like before, could make the whole cafeteria laugh like always. But a part of him, a small but very clear part, was whispering to him that this was not the Jaden Carter he knew. Jaden still stood there, his gaze unwavering, waiting, no fear, no hesitation. Only one thing was evident in his eyes, a warning. And for the first time in his life, Bradley Walker felt like he was standing before a real opponent. Bradley looked straight at Jaden, his eyes flashing with irritation, mixed with a hint of confusion that he didn't want to admit in the past. Whenever he had threatened Jaden, the kid always reacted as expected. Either he'd lower his head and avoid eye contact, or stand still, like a statue waiting to be humiliated, without ever fighting back. But today, from his gaze to his stance, from his voice to his attitude, everything exuded an unusual calmness, a kind of serenity that made Bradley uncomfortable. He couldn't accept that he needed to reaffirm his position, to show Jaden that everything was still in his hands, that the kid's antics meant nothing, and there was only one way to do that. Bradley clenched his fist, the muscles in his arm tightening as he swung a punch toward Jaden without a second thought. He didn't doubt for a moment that his punch would hit its target over the years. He had done this countless times, and the result was always the same. Jaden would be knocked to the floor, ridiculed in front of everyone, and things would return to normal where Bradley remained the ruler, and Jaden remained an invisible figure who simply endured. But just as his fist was about to connect with Jaden, something entirely unexpected happened. Jaden didn't stand there taking it like he always had. There was no shrinking or trembling this time, instead, in a brief moment that Bradley couldn't even register. Right away, Jaden moved, not a panicked step backward or a clumsy head turned to dodge. He moved with perfect precision, just enough to let Bradley's punch graze through the air, creating a perfect gap between his fist and Jaden's face. There was no fear in that movement, just control so cold and calculated as though Jaden knew exactly what was about to happen, before Bradley even threw the punch. In that moment, Bradley felt that something was wrong. His punch missed its mark, and as soon as he lost the resistance, he expected a feeling of imbalance spread throughout his body. He felt himself leaning forward, his center of gravity shifting his legs, losing control. And just before he could react, a sudden force swept beneath him. In the blink of an eye, he could no longer stand. All he felt was his feet being lifted off the ground, his body losing its support, followed by a brief moment of weightlessness, before the full weight of his body crashed onto the floor. The sound of the impact rang out clearly in the eerily silent room. His back slammed into the cafeteria floor, his breath knocked out of him while those around him hadn't yet realized what had happened. Bradley Walker, the one who had always been at the center of every confrontation, the one who always struck first and had never been defeated, was now lying flat on the ground, his eyes wide in shock, trying to find an explanation for what had just occurred. The entire cafeteria seemed frozen. In that moment, there were no loud laughs, no bustling conversations, no usual noises, All eyes were fixed in the same direction. All breaths seemed to be held. All thoughts seemed to come to a halt. No one had ever imagined this scenario. No one had ever thought this day would come, the day when Bradley Walker, the ruler of the school halls, the one everyone feared, would be taken down in front of everyone. Jaden stood there, his gaze calm, as if what had just happened was nothing to concern him. No unnecessary movements, no signs of excitement or arrogance, no words of provocation. He didn't need to say anything, because this moment spoke for itself. Bradley blinked his breath shallow as he pushed himself up from the floor. Rage surged in his chest, not just from the pain of the fall, but from the humiliation that couldn't be erased. He wanted to lunge forward immediately to land a punch on Jaden and reclaim his tarnished honor in front of everyone. But then his eyes met Jaden's, and instantly he felt something stop his anger. There was no mockery in those eyes, no boasting or gloating, no challenge, only one message, sharp and clear like a cold blade. I'm not afraid of you anymore. And in that moment Bradley knew he had lost, not because of the fall, not because of the pain coursing through his body, but because, for the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. Everything had changed. His position wasn't as solid as he had believed that day. He didn't just lose his reputation, he lost the most important thing to him, the fear he once held in his hands. The cafeteria was still silent, but this time the silence wasn't waiting for some spectacle. It was stunned by witnessing something no one expected. Jaden Carter was no longer the prey, and though no one dared to speak it, everyone understood that from now on, nothing would ever be the same. Again, Bradley pressed his hands to the floor, his breath still ragged as he tried to lift his body up. The fall wasn't too painful, but the feeling of being stripped of control made him panic in a way he had never experienced. As soon as he raised his head, his gaze swept across the people around him, and immediately he felt something very unfamiliar, something that had never existed in this room before. No one laughed. No applause, no mocking laughter, no one uttered a teasing word to ease the tension every other time. Whenever he humiliated someone, the crowd around him always cheered, always rallied behind him as though he were a king in the arena, where he held the power to decide who would be the next to fall. But this time, he heard nothing but a heavy, lingering silence, so oppressive it could crush any justifications in his mind. He turned his head, desperately searching for a familiar face in the crowd, a friend, an ally, anyone who could throw him a sympathetic eyebrow, raise a mocking laugh at Jaden, something he could cling to so he could feel that everything was still under control, but he found nothing. He only saw empty St. Stairs. No one looked at him as a ruler anymore. No one looked at him with the same fearful gaze as before. Every eye was fixed on Jaden, not with pity, not with mockery, but with astonishment. Astonishment at someone they had once thought was the weakest in the school. Someone they had grown used to seeing as a joke, now standing there with an entirely different presence, not arrogance, not defiance, not an attempt to appear frightening, just simply a powerful presence that no one could deny. Bradley felt as though someone had pulled the rug out from under him. He had always thought his power lay in his fists, in his size, in the physical strength no one dared challenge, but he was wrong. His true power, the thing that had kept him at the top all this time, was the fear of others. And in this moment, as he looked at Jaden, he realized that had disappeared. Jaden was no longer afraid of him, and that made him lose everything he could try to stand up. He could keep fighting, he could charge at Jaden to try to regain what he had lost, but he didn't dare not, because he feared being defeated, but because there was an even greater fear that no matter what he did, he would never regain the power he had lost. Bradley had never felt so small. He swallowed, feeling his throat dry for years. He had been used to walking down the school hallways with the air of a predator, his gaze sweeping over those weaker than him, as though he had the right to choose who would be the next target. But now, as he looked at the crowd, he realized a bitter truth. He was no longer the hunter, he had become the prey. The silence in the cafeteria stretched a little longer before someone cleared their throat lightly, breaking the tension in the air. Whispers slowly spread, but no one dared speak too loudly. No one wanted to be the first to break this moment. Some students quietly lowered their heads as if trying to hide their own astonishment. Others still stared at Jaden, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Jaden still stood there saying nothing. He didn't need to say anything. It was the way he held himself, calm, not arrogant, not putting Bradley down, not trying to humiliate him, that made everyone look at him differently. No one had thought he would win, but now no one could deny that he had. And that was more terrifying than any punch. Bradley felt his hand clench into a fist, but he didn't dare do anything. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew that no matter what he did, he had already lost for the first time in his life. He felt powerless. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be looked down on, and the worst part was, he couldn't do anything to change it. The next morning, the school, which had always been lively with laughter and animated conversations along the hallways, now seemed to be engulfed in a strange and unfamiliar atmosphere. No one said anything, but everyone knew that today was not an ordinary day. An important event had taken place yesterday, and its aftershock still reverberated in the minds of all the students who were in the cafeteria. At that time, Bradley Walker, who had once been the nightmare of weaker students who had walked through the halls like a king without a crown, was now defeated, but not just defeated by simple violence, but by the very thing he had always used to control others' fear. But today, the only person missing from the school was Bradley, when the bell rang signaling the start of the first-class students began heading to their classrooms. But no one had seen him. Some speculated that he was just running late, while others thought he might have been suspended for fighting, but as the morning went by without any sign of him, everyone realized the truth. Bradley did. It didn't dare come to school. Whispers spread faster than anything. What started as soft murmurs quickly became the main topic of conversation. But what was striking was that no one spoke about Jaden as a joke anymore now. When people mentioned the confrontation from yesterday, when groups of friends gathered to recount the event, Jaden was no longer the supporting character in the story. He was no longer the bullied kid, no longer the weakling that everyone was familiar with. The main character of that story, the one who was most talked about, was Bradley. But this time he wasn't being talked about as a ruler. He was being talked about as a failure. The story of him spread throughout the school, through every lunch table, every hallway, and every classroom. Everyone recounted the moment when he swung a punch at Jaden, thinking that like every other time, he would end the fight with a single seg. But just when he thought he was about to hit his target, Jaden disappeared from his sight in a stunning manner, causing him to lose his balance and fall flat in front of the entire cafeteria. He didn't just lose, he was knocked down in a humiliating way, in a manner no one could have imagined, by the very person he had once looked down upon. Those who had once supported him, who had laughed every time he mocked, others were now discussing his downfall. Not because they felt sorry for him or regretted it, but simply because Bradley Walker was no longer the strongest. And when a ruler loses their power, everything they once had will crumble along with it on the other side of the school. Jaden walked slowly down the hallway, still carrying his usual calm demeanor. But today, everything was different. There were no mocking glances, no sneering laughter or sarcastic remarks like before, no groups of students trying to block his path, attempting to push him into some corner to ridicule him. Today, for the first time in his school life, Jaden walked without feeling like someone was watching him. Waiting for an embarrassing moment, some students quietly nodded as he passed by, while others simply stepped aside, no longer seeing him as someone they could easily trample on. He didn't need to threaten anyone, didn't need to act tough or try to prove himself. He just needed to no longer be afraid, and that was enough to change everything. But for Bradley, things weren't that simple. After the mocking laughter faded from the hallways at that time, Bradley Walker, who had once been the nightmare of weaker students, who had walked through the halls like a king without a crown, was now defeated, but not just defeated by simple violence, but by the very thing he had always used to control others, fear. But today, the only person missing from the school was Bradley. When the bell rang signaling the start of the first class, students began heading to their classrooms. But no one had seen him. Some speculated that he was just running late, while others thought he might have been suspended for fighting. But as the morning went by without any sign of him, everyone realized the truth. Bradley did. It didn't dare come to school. Whispers spread faster than anything. What started as soft murmurs quickly became the main topic of conversation. But what was striking was that no one spoke about Jaden as a joke anymore now when people mentioned the confrontation from yesterday, when groups of friends gathered to recount the event. Jaden was no longer the supporting character in the story. He was no longer the bullied kid, no longer the weakling, that everyone was familiar with the main character of that story. The one who was most talked about was Bradley, but this time he wasn't being talked about as a ruler. He was being talked about as a failure. The story of him spread throughout the school, through every lunch table, every hallway, and every classroom. Everyone recounted the moment when he swung a punch at Jaden, thinking that like every other time, he would end the fight with a single stick. But just when he thought he was about to hit his target, Jaden disappeared from his sight in a stunning manner, causing him to lose his balance and fall flat in front of the entire cafeteria. He didn't just lose, he was knocked down in a humiliating way, in a manner no one could have imagined, by the very person he had once looked down upon. Those who had once supported him, who had laughed every time he mocked others, were now discussing his downfall. Not because they felt sorry for him or regretted it, but simply because Bradley Walker was no longer the strongest. And when a ruler loses their power, everything they once had will crumble along with it on the other side of the school. Jaden walked slowly down the hallway, still carrying his usual calm demeanor. But today, everything was different. There were no mocking glances, no sneering laughter or sarcastic remarks like before, no groups of students trying to block his path, attempting to push him into some corner to ridicule him today. For the first time in his school life, Jaden walked without feeling like someone was watching him, waiting for an embarrassing moment. Some students quietly nodded as he passed by, while others simply stepped aside, no longer seeing him as someone they could easily trample on. He didn't need to threaten anyone, didn't need to act tough or try to prove himself. He just needed to no longer be afraid. And that was enough to change everything. But for Bradley, things weren't that simple after the mocking laughter faded from the hallways after. He had practiced in his mind hundreds of times what he wanted to say. But now, when he had to face the person he once looked down on, he felt more nervous than ever. Taking a deep breath, he moved closer, feeling his heart beat strongly in his chest, not from fear, but from something else. Shame. He had never had to say these words before, but this time, he had no other choice. "I'm sorry." The short sentence carried a weight that even Bradley didn't expect. Jaden was silent for a moment, then slowly closed his locker, turning to look at him. Bradley didn't avoid his gaze like before, he looked straight at him. But this time, there was no arrogance, no disdain, no trace of the person who once believed he could control everything around him. There was only a person standing in front of another, trying to make up for past mistakes. Jaden stared at him for a long while, then said nothing. He simply nodded slightly, as if forgiveness didn't need to be spoken, but was simply an acceptance that the past was over, and all that remained now was a choice about who each person wanted to become. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Bradley standing there with a heart that felt lighter, but full of conflicting thoughts. He didn't know that forgiveness could come so simply, but no matter what he knew, this was the beginning of a new path. A path where, for the first time in his life, he would have to learn to walk without relying on the fear of others to support him. Bradley stood there, silently watching. Jaden's figure disappeared down the hallway, his mind filled with thoughts he had never allowed himself to face. He had once believed that strength belonged to those who could impose their power over others. That fear was the tool to control everything around him. He believed that by making others feel small, he could become stronger. But now, after everything, he realized that the very fear he had instilled had become the thing that imprisoned him in his own world. A week ago, he was the one on top, the one everyone feared, the one who could control anyone he wanted. But in a single moment, everything changed, and the most painful part wasn't being defeated. It wasn't the image of him falling in the cafeteria, but the truth that he had lost the respect he once had for himself. Jaden didn't defeat him because he was physically stronger. He didn't defeat him because he knew how to fight. Jaden won because he was no longer afraid. And when a bully loses the power of fear, they are left with nothing but an empty name. Bradley thought back to the moment when he stood in the cafeteria that day waiting for the laughter of the crowd after his fall, but receiving only heavy silence. That was when he realized that all those who had cheered him on, stood by him, and laughed with him, had never truly seen him as a person of value. They were simply followers of power, and when that power disappeared, they turned their backs just as quickly. But Jaden was different. He didn't need to make others afraid to gain respect. He only needed to not let fear control him. This isn't a story about a bullied boy rising up for revenge. This isn't a story about who's stronger or weaker. This isn't just a story about a physical fight. This is a story about justice. Justice is not revenge, not taking back what was taken through violence. Justice is balance. It's making those who spread fear understand that they no longer have control. Bradley used to be the one who spread that fear, but now he is the one who feels the invisible burden he once made others bear. Jaden didn't need to do anything more. He didn't need to walk the path of people like Bradley. He just needed to continue living without letting the past hold him back, and that is the true victory. As for Bradley, he doesn't know if he can change, but one thing he knows for sure: he never wants to go back to who he was. Perhaps each of us has been in a similar situation. Perhaps you've been Jaden, a person underestimated, looked down upon, placed in the role of the weak, or perhaps hard as it may be. To admit you've been Bradley, a person who believes strength comes from controlling others, but in the end, this story isn't about who wins or loses. It's about awakening. Awakening from fear. Awakening from illusions of power. Awakening to understand that respect doesn't come from making others bow, but from daring to stand up. Have you ever been in a similar situation? Have you ever witnessed a bully lose their power? Or have you faced your fears and found a way to overcome them? Share your thoughts. And if this story makes you reflect, remember that true strength isn't in the punch, but in knowing when not to throw it. Jaden Carter's story isn't just a battle between the strong and the weak. It's the journey of a person reclaiming themselves, learning to face their fears, and earning the respect they truly deserve. It shows us that sometimes the best way to win isn't through retaliation, but through not letting fear control you anymore. What do you think about this story? If you've ever faced a bully, how would you handle it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you love inspiring and meaningful stories like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.